So today I am going to be talking to you about FPP or foundation paper piecing and sharing some of my tips. Foundation paper piecing is a method of patchwork piecing where you sew fabric to the paper template in order to create your finished patchwork block. When sewing FPP, you will get a block like this printed out on paper. You will hopefully have a 1-inch test square, so you can measure that to make sure it is 1 inch, and that makes sure that the rest of your template is the correct size. Your template should have numbered and letters sections. This goes A1, A2, A3, 4, 5, 6, and that is the order in which you will sew your pieces. If the pattern has more than one piece, you will have another section that will be marked B1, B2, B3, and maybe C1, C2, C3, and you'll get instructions of how to join those pieces together. But for today, I'm just going to be showing you using this one complete flying geese block. So when you get your template, you will roughly cut out around the outer line here. We will then sew in order, and we will sew on these lines here and place the fabric on this side here. When you sew exactly on the lines and you work your way up through the numbers. As I mentioned before, the fabric is on the other side and the fabrics are still laid right sides together. Before we begin sewing, we want to make sure that we have printed off enough copies. We have checked that 1-inch test square to make sure that everything is printed to the correct size. A quick tip before you print is to make sure that you print it at 100% or actual size. I've got all my fabrics cut and we're ready to sew. Okay, so I've got my pattern printed out, I've got my fabrics cut, and I'm ready to go. So you can see section 1 here is going to be covered by this fabric. You want to make sure that when you are working on a section and you lay the fabric on, I'll be laying it on the other side, but you want to make sure it covers at least 1/4 inch around the whole section here. So the first line we're going to sew is the line between 1 and 2, so it's this line here. So I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to make sure that I've lined my fabric up to cover 1/4 inch past this top part and 1/4 inch past all of these lines. That looks about right, like that. And then if you want to, you can pop a little bit of fabric glue here just to hold this in place. What I'm going to do is just fold this back and just create a crease where we're going to be sewing in a minute, just along that line between A1 and A2. That's the line that's created there. And I'm going to lay my A2 piece right sides together with 1/4 inch over that line that we've created. I'm going to clip that in, pin that in place through the fabric and through the paper. What you can do to test is stick it in the seam allowance and then fold it back along where that line is, and you can see that that will fully cover section 2 here. Just going to move that more central. Then we can take that over to the sewing machine, lay it on the sewing machine nice and flat, make sure nothing gets caught, and we're going to sew along this line. We're going to start a few millimeters before this point here. We're going to sew all the way along the line and just a few millimeters past where it finishes. You're also going to make sure that you reduce your stitch length on your sewing machine. I like to reduce mine down to about 1.5. This helps to keep the stitches in place when it comes to ripping the paper out later. And that's what it looks like when it's sewn. So I've sewn the line between 1 and 2. You can then trim down any excess, trim it down to 1/4 inch. So that's 1/4 inch past the stitched line. And then you can just fold that back, making sure it covers all of section 2, like that. And you can press that in place. We're then going to sew the next line. So that's for section 3. So that's here, that's the next one. And we're going to do what we did before. We're just going to fold that back to create a crease in the fabric. And then lay our section 3 piece on top with 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to pin that in place, and just like we did before, we're going to flip it over, take it to the sewing machine and sew down there. And as before, you can then trim down your seam allowance. Fold it back, press that in place with a dry iron and work on your next line. So that's this one here. I haven't pressed it, but I would just fold the line, and then I'll be working on the next coloured piece. So that's that one for A4. Pin it in place, flip it over, stitch along the line. When you have sewn all the sections, it will look like this. So you've sewn all the lines apart from this outer line, which is what you'll use when you attach the block to something else. You can then use this outer dotted line here to trim down your block to the size that you need. And that is your finished block. And now you can remove the paper. If you want, you can sew this in to whatever other project you are doing. So if you've got other blocks to make and sew them together, you can do that first. And you can use this as a guide for your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Or if you want to, you can do it now. I recommend just folding the lines and gently pulling along that stitched seam, which will create a perforated seam. And you just want to be as gentle as you can but get all the paper out. And that is a little introduction for FPP, or foundation paper piecing. Just remember that the fabrics still go right sides together. You're still using 1/4 inch seam allowance. The only difference is you have that paper in between where you're stitching and your fabric, but you can use these lines to sew really accurately and create lovely pointy points.